And it's become, government by borrowing. And I fear that if we do not have a change of heart and mind in this town in an effort to do right by voters, ultimately we're going to suffer some sort of exogenous shock, whether the bond market goes berserk or something else goes very, very bad. And then the country is going to suffer collectively. And it'll suffer because the people who are supposed to be stewards of our nation's finances took the easy road.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have someone else who knows a lot about government projects, the budget, and has been working on a lot of these issues for a while, and is going to tell us a lot about these things and what we should know and expect for the future. And it's none other than Dr. Kevin Kosar. Kevin, welcome to Let People Prosper show.
Vance, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's my pleasure. It really is. And as I was saying your last name, I might have mispronounced it. How do you pronounce your last name?
Kosar, a bit like Bernie Kosar,
okay,
who once quarterbacked the Browns. He was a distant relation, yeah.
All right. I thought so, but I wanted to make sure. Didn't want to mess that up. So for the audience, let me go ahead and give them your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So Kevin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also known as AEI, where he studies the U.S. Congress, the administrative state, American politics, election reform, and the U.S. Postal Service. Before joining AEI, Dr. Kosar was at the R Street Institute, where he served as vice president of policy, Vice President of Research Partnerships, and Senior Fellow and Director of the Government Project. He also co-founded the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, legbranch.org, a transpartisan project to strengthen the legislative branch. Earlier, Dr. Kosar spent more than a decade working for the Congressional Research Service, where he focused on wide range of public administration issues. He has taught public policy at New York University and lectured on public administration at Metropolitan College of New York. So, with all that background and everything else, and all the great work that you're already doing, Kevin, why do you do what you do every day?
I wish I knew.
Nice.
No, I love our constitutional republic, but it's not a machine that runs on its own. It needs engaged citizens. It needs engaged public servants. It's a system of government that is designed to let anybody, any amateur, any person from any corner of this country flow in and have a hand at governing. And I'm excited. I mean, I don't wield formal powers, obviously. I'm not an elected official, but I get to study stuff that they need to work on and then tell them what I know and hope they, take the advice. So it's exciting. It's exciting. Yeah. It's interesting. It's often frustrating. The work is never, ever done.
Yeah. Well, there is some sort of, you have some work. It's always cut out for you. There's always something else to do. Some longevity there with the career of working in public policy, because there's always something else the government seems to be screwing up next. And so I wonder, Kevin, with your background, was there, pivotal institutional changes or tipping points in your life that kind of got you set on this path of working in public policy?
It was, to some degree, accidental. I thought I was going to be an academic, and I thought I was going to be a political theorist, and that my job would be to show up to class and try to make 18 and 19-year-olds excited about Plato, Aristotle, and all the great books. But I was right at the cusp of writing a dissertation in graduate school when I kind of looked around and realized there were no jobs that I was likely to get. And moreover, if I wanted to get tenure, I would pretty much have to turn political theory into a torment, because getting tenure means writing for academic journals and writing for an academic audience and basically adding to the literature, saying something that no other academic has previously said. And that didn't strike me as fun. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to do public policy. And the thing that stuck in my craw since I was a teenager was education. Who's in charge of it? What should it be? Which is ultimately a philosophical question. So I wrote a dissertation on Congress and education policy, and that kind of set me up to come to Washington, D.C. and work at the Library of Congress, and then just kind of build off of that in my studies of national governance.
Wow. Nice. It's interesting, as I'm talking to different folks and having them on the program, is hearing where they're coming from, and each person has something different. But I think there's always this interest in, wanting to do something different, wanting to help people. Mine was Let People Prosper. That's why I named it the podcast. Let People Prosper is where I feel like my calling is in life. And so I was kind of like you, where I thought maybe I wanted to go to academia and teach for a while. But then I started writing more, and I still publish in academic journals every once in a while, just to keep my foot in that door. But at the same time, how many people are reading those papers? It's difficult to make big changes from academia compared to what I consider white papers or policy briefs that we can have a direct influence on politicians, influencers, and others who listen to this podcast and others out there. That really got me into it. Was that part of it for you as well?
Yeah. I mean, it's being an educator.
Yeah.
I could have been a professor, and I could have had students who were captive to my classroom and forced to listen to me. But instead, I was at the Library of Congress, and I had congressional staff and legislators coming to me, asking me to figure stuff out and help them out so they could discharge their responsibilities. And then think tankery is the same thing. Write a lot for Capitol Hill, talk a lot to media trying to learn up on issues. And AEI very much has an eye towards the next generation. They have the sense that, we're not going to be here forever. We need to set up the next generation to be able to carry on the work of governance. And so we get a lot of students coming through here where I get to have guest talks and lectures and coffees with them and kind of do that educating. It's fun.
Yeah, that's great. What other issues, or which issues do you primarily work on at AEI?
Well, I certainly spent a lot of time on Congress, trying to figure out ways to reform it in all its operations and everything, educating people on how this weird beast works. I mean, Congress is a very complicated, convoluted, difficult to understand thing. It's frequently misunderstood, which is one reason why I 2 months ago created a website called understandingcongress.org, which it's aiming to explain, because it's so hard to understand what is going on there. It builds off my Understanding Congress podcast. But I also spent a good deal of time on dealing with Postal Service, which is a perennially running deficits and on the verge of collapse. Think a lot about governance more generally. Like, what do we want from our constitutional system? What do we owe our constitutional system? Plenty of subjects. There's always something interesting to dig into.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll be sure to put understandingcongress.org and your podcast on the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com and send that out as well. I've looked over understandingcongress.org. It's a great tool to be able to use to understand Congress, because you're right, it is a massive beast. I think oftentimes it's something that many people are, especially those of us on the right, or get frustrated with Congress. Maybe they overspend, maybe they do something or can't get something done, and probably many on the left as well will get upset because they're not doing more or doing what they want them to do. But how with it, just kind of starting there with your work on this and with Congress, we haven't talked too much about this on the show. Why is it so tough? Why does it take an act of Congress, if you will, to get something done?
Yeah, well, that's the nature of constitutional government, isn't it? I mean, remember, there was a book I read as an undergraduate way back when, where Herman Bells wrote, "Constitutional government is limited government." And the idea is that government shall only do what the people have asked it to do via the Constitution and via their popular consent. And so that's the idea, is that we should only get new policy and more policy if the people's representatives act. And that means collectively in the House, collectively in the Senate, and then a presidential signature. Now, unfortunately, what we've seen is that policy-making authority, that law-making authority, has seeped over into the executive branch and to the judiciary, which has really distorted the system and created some fundamental confusions about who's in charge. And I think one of the great projects of conservative thinkers and voters should be trying to rebalance the separation of power system so that there's a little less lawmaking going on by branches that aren't supposed to be making law.
Yeah, yeah, that's true, and you see that especially in the executive branch. Even, I mean, I was there for a year in the Trump administration, and there were some things that I liked as far as deregulation goes and things of that nature. But also in the back of my mind, I was always thinking like, this is probably Congress should be doing more of this, not the executive branch, because, let's say we agreed with some of the deregulation by the Trump administration. Well, as soon as the next administration comes in and Biden, what do? They they add all those regulations back, or they make those rules again. And so it makes it very, very volatile. And of course, in the productive private sector, uncertainty is something they do not like. So when you have this uncertainty going on back and forth, it makes it very difficult to plan for the future as a business owner and everything else. Is that kind of something what you're getting at there?
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember in the Trump administration, it was very interesting that, we were going to get regulatory budgeting. We were going to get, one reg in, two regs out. There was all sorts of things that were put in place. Unfortunately, they were put in place through executive order. And what happens? Very first day he was in office, or very first week, Mr. Biden said, nope, these things all go away. And, we get the same thing on immigration. Obama issued immigration executive orders. Trump did different ones. Biden does other ones. Like that sort of instability, not good for free peoples.
No, definitely not. And when you're looking at Congress, I wanted to get your thought on this. I've heard some people say, well, maybe we should have more members of Congress. Like the 435, and there's some descriptions of this in the Federalist Papers, and the proportional and things of that nature. What are your thoughts after you've studied this for years and been an expert in this area?
Yeah, I think when I first heard this idea, I probably, like most Americans, kind of flinched, like, oh, last thing we need is more politicians. But then when I looked at the ratio of the individual legislator to the number of constituents, it's one member of the House on average represents 740 or 760,000 people. That's the sort of thing that would give James Madison a heart attack. And you look at the average member of Congress who has like 18 staff. Like, can you imagine a 19-person firm trying to service 760,000 people? I mean, just figuring out what they want, to say nothing of acting on it, hugely difficult. I think it's worth discussing, but we can't certainly have a Congress that ends up looking like, what is that intergalactic legislature in Star Wars, where it's like bazillions of people. Like, that'll just be a mess. So you might add a modest number of members to the House. The Senate, that's a whole other problem because it's fixed in the Constitution. You get 2 senators per state. We're not adding more states as far as I know. So,
right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that was something too. My initial reaction, I'm still kind of wrestling with it, but my initial reaction is, man, I don't want more people in there screwing it up. But at the margin, each person would have, it would make different marginal changes based on the decisions that they make and who they're representing. So there could be some benefits there. I'll take what you say and kind of keep wrestling with it. That's something great about our constitutional republic, and our federal system of federalism is that we have this laboratory. Some say laboratory of democracy. I usually say laboratory of competition. But there's this laboratory that we have going on that maybe we can make some changes along the way.
Yeah, we are free to command our own destiny if we can just pull ourselves together to give new things a try. I mean, one thing I often say to my friends on the right is, man, I understand the flinch. You don't want to grow the legislative branch in any way, shape, or form, but realizing the executive branch has been growing like crazy. We have a Madisonian system. Yeah. Who's going to hold the power? Do you want the people's representatives to hold it for all their goofiness in certain ways and incoherence and amateurism? Or do you want it all from the administrative state? You take your pick. I pick the people.
Yeah, sure. And we're not a direct democracy. So to your point, like we don't want millions of people or something like that. So there's still a representative republic that's there. It's just a matter of, how many and everything else. So I think those are great points there, Kevin. When we're going into, speaking of things that we can try out, is this book, Government Project. I'm holding it here in my hand for those who are listening. It's Edward C. Banfield, was the original author of this. AEI recently re-released it with a foreword by yours truly, Kevin Kosar there. So it's good to have you in there. And to be honest with you, Kevin, I hadn't heard of the book. And you published this, and then there was a presentation that you gave at AEI, one of the events, maybe last month, here pretty recently. And I was kind of blown away. I was like, well, hadn't I seen this before? And so I got the book. I read it, and I thought it really provides a lot of good insights of maybe what can work with some government projects, what doesn't work very well. And so I'm really glad that I read it. But I wanted to get, and that's one reason why I wanted to talk to you. We've met before, and I've been following your work for a long time anyway, but I thought this would be another good opportunity for us to talk. What are your key insights that you like to share about the book? And then we can kind of, dive deeper into it.
Well, I guess I should, say that my motivation was in part fulfilling what I feel is a duty of an educator, which is pointing people towards things worthy of their attention. I mean, thanks to the internet, we have more content than mankind has ever had. And you can spend your whole day looking at cat videos. I don't know if that's good for you.
Yeah.
So as an educator, this is something I wanted to bring back because it'd been out of print since the 1950s. And it's an important book for a variety of reasons, but not least because it shows how hard it is for a federal government agency to do something to make America better. I think it's a modern habit of mind that we've kind of gotten into post New Deal, and now it's kind of on steroids, where we look out and we say, that's a problem. That's not fair. That's wrong. There should be a government program to do that and to fix it. And what this shows is well, maybe you're right. There should or shouldn't be a government program, but whether it's going to work, that's a whole nother issue, because government programs require a lot of coordination, and it presupposes that people share the same view of a problem, are committed to solving it in the same way, and that policymakers actually understand the problem correctly and have figured out the right intervention. You can have all the best intentions in the world, and you could be super smart and still make complete hash of things, which is what this book details.
Yeah. I thought I did a great job of it too. So you're right. So it was a 1951 edition, right? When it was first released, and with this government project, it's interesting how it all came together, and the different insights and everything else, and the number of years that it lasted, and the cost. And I wonder, and it was great too, hearing some of the stories, right? Banfield did a great job of accounting for what the project was. I wish we had more of that actually today. We have all these government projects, but how much of that is really, what are the insights that we're gaining? We gain the amount of money or maybe some of the outcomes, but we don't hear as much from the people that are on these programs. And what are some of the other things that really got them thinking about doing this sort of project compared to others?
Oh, geez. As far as the Rex Tugwell and the New Deal administration. Yeah. Amity Shlaes wrote a great book years ago about the New Deal, wherein she really showed that FDR and company had been kind of given carte blanche by Congress. I mean, they really turned FDR into basically a blue Caesar who could just do whatever the heck he wanted. And it was a lot of throwing pasta at the wall and see what would stick. And this was an instance where he just dropped an executive order creating this, first the resettlement agency, and then he dropped another executive order and called it the Farm Security Administration or agency, and put Columbia economist in charge of it, a guy who is rather enamored of collectivism and had visited the Soviet Union, and said, go do great things. And the idea was that, hey, America was suffering because of the Dust Bowl. You had all these displaced rural workers and farmers whose farms had collapsed. Maybe you could make their lives better. You don't have to accept that capitalism simply developed in this way. This is a period of transition, and that bad weather, bad luck had come together, and that this too will pass. No, government intervention can come, and it can save the day. And help all these poor people. And so the idea was, well, we're just going to take these folks who are desperate and put them together on a big farm, and they can farm collectively, and they can share in the ownership of it and share in the work, share in the profits if it made any. And, they'll get to be citizens fully because they'll also have a voice in running the place. That was the kind of dream behind this thing. Which was just done without any congressional approval. It was just done.
Yeah. Which kind of goes back to our points earlier about so much power in the executive branch. We saw a lot of that happen during then. And it's interesting nowadays, like most of the right will be like, oh, that was bad. But yet they'll want to do some of the same things today. But I digress. I'll come back to this. With this farm and the setup, I mean, people were living on this project in this area. They would come in from places, and Banfield noted the trips that people would take, and they would leave basically everything and go to this place because they were provided most things that they wanted at the time, and they would get paid for doing things on the farm, and they could exchange and everything. So I thought that was pretty interesting, but it was interesting, but it was also interesting to note the side effects, right? Like, just because they were given some of these things doesn't mean that they had prosperity, that they were better off overall. And so what were some of the challenges that you noticed as you were reading the book and being told by Banfield as well?
Yeah. I mean, so these are migrants. I mean, these were people who were moving from place to place. This government project was set up in Arizona, and people came from far, far away because they were looking for work. They were in a bad, bad way. Desperately poor people. I mean, you had kids who had nutritional deficiencies that were messing with their health. Yeah. And so you had this project, and this project said, look, you come here, you say you got some farming experience, you want to be able to cooperate with others. We're going to give you a brand new community. We just built it up. Roads. Each one of you gets a nice house with all the modern amenities, probably stuff that you never had, like a flush toilet, running water, your own backyard, electricity. Like, it was a pretty good deal if you looked at it from just materialism. And get this, you get a steady paycheck because you're running this farm year round. You get paid. And if it prospers, you get profits from it. So there's no more of this getting hired on seasonally and then the farmer lets you go and you have to move on. You can have steady income. This is Shangri-La. This is pretty darn good deal. And people signed up for it. About 60 families signed up for it. But within 7 years, the people took a vote and decided, we don't want to do this anymore. And they liquidated the farm. Yeah. And they didn't walk away with gobs of money in their pocket. They often went back to migrant farming. Or walked away with very little. So policymakers in Washington were baffled that somebody could be so economically irrational. And so one of the great lessons of the book is that, man doesn't live by bread alone. And this is what the central kind of point against Sovietism and communism is, which is all about materialism. You make the people happy by just giving them material stuff. And no, you don't make them happy. They were unhappy. They feuded amongst themselves. And that's, that's an important lesson. Redistribution is not going to create happiness. People need more than that to be happy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's interesting too, though, Kevin, because a lot of folks more on the left who want more socialism or think that socialism is great is they'll kind of cast out the capitalism as being all about materialism. But from your point, which is a great point, is that they're focused on materialism.
Yeah.
From a top-down approach, though, right?
Yeah, I mean that was another interesting thing with government project is
Yeah.
that as Banfield went out and talked to the various farmers and settlers there, um, almost to a person, they just were not showing intense appreciation for the material wealth they had been given
Mm.
because it hadn't been earned. These were
Mm-hmm.
people who all their lives had, what they got in their pocket was what they earned. If they could afford a small shack to live in, it's because they earned it. Um, they could be so lucky as to own an automobile, it's because they earned it. And therefore they took pride in it. Whereas what they had
Yeah.
been given by the government, they took less pride in. And that's why it was easier for them to just walk away from this bounty, much to the confusion of policymakers.
Yeah, yeah. I remember one of the stories. Can't remember the names right now, but there was one of the story. You might know the names, but the story where they went back home and they saw
Mm.
what others were doing around them, and they were working hard and they were out doing their thing, and they took what they had with it from the farm, their income and everything else. They went, visited their family. It might have been in Texas. I don't remember, but they went somewhere, and they went to visit their family, and they saw all this stuff, and their money started being depleted quickly, and they were like, well, I don't really want to do any of this stuff. And so they left, and they went back to Arizona where the project was, and had very little when they got back. But they were so relieved to get back because of, the farm was providing everything for them and everything else. I just thought that was interesting for them to see that change. And then later on, they're basically like, well, no, we don't really want to stay on this farm anymore, from the group that voted on dissolving it and everything else. But that was so instrumental to me when I was reading it. I was like, oh man, that makes a lot of sense, because to your point, there wasn't that earned success. And
Yeah.
so when they left and when they went back home, it was just totally different from what they had been used to while they were on the project, right?
Yeah. I mean, you could see kind of what, later decades, 70s
Yeah.
and 80s developed into, what was kind of described as a welfare trap.
Hmm.
You put people on government aid and then they kind of resent it. They feel embarrassed that they're taking aid. But then when it comes to coming off the aid, it's like they've lost the ability to ride the bike. And so you're pulling off the training wheels and it creates anxiety. And then they want to go back onto the aid because that was the safe place to be.
Yeah.
Because it reduces risk.
Yeah.
We talk about a safety net. Well, the net is to protect you from risk. And yeah, you definitely saw that. I mean, Banfield spent a lot of time observing that what he saw was a lot of inner turmoil on these individuals that had just simply not been accounted for by policymakers. I mean, Rex Tugwell, bless his heart, he made this mess in the desert. He wrote the introduction of the Banfield's book. And he admitted it. We didn't pay enough to attention to the psychological ramifications of our effort at doing something nice for people, and that was to our detriment.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And when they left at the end and they closed down the government project, you said they went back to being just migrant farm workers. I can't remember this right offhand, but was there any follow up where they were later, or was that kind of where they stopped? I forget exactly how it ended there at the end.
Yeah, there was a little bit of kind of immediate description of where people landed. Some people were out trying to set up their own individual farms with what little money they had. Others had gone into kind of back into migrant seasonal worker status.
Yeah.
Ultimately, how these people's lives played out, nobody's traced it. I mean, Banfield, I should say, he was a new dealer. He worked as a PR flack for like the Timber Salvage Administration and then later the Farm Security Agency. He was a believer in central planning, rationalism. His visit to Casa Grande farm in Arizona put him on a different path in life because what he saw there just undercut all of his assumptions about the ease with which government can fix stuff.
Wow. Wow. I didn't realize that. That's interesting tidbit there, because a lot of folks who now we think of as the free market folks. Some of my favorite economists, Frederick Hayek, started off as a socialist. Milton Friedman, he was a government planner at the time. I mean, then they turned more in that direction as they learned more or experienced more in the process. So it's interesting to hear about Banfield kind of doing the same thing. That's fascinating. I wonder from your work, Kevin, kind of diving more into what you do and have done it here in the last few minutes we have together. How has this book influenced your work? Whenever you look at the macro situation and the fiscal deficits and debt and the mounting problems we have with, quote unquote entitlement or mandatory outlays, and other types of project that the government seems to be wanting to get involved from the left and the right. I mean, I think this is a bipartisan problem in many ways, but I wonder how it's influenced your work, Kevin.
Well, it's made me think hard about a really fundamental question, which is, how can human beings in a shared society collaborate, partner for collective gain, and through what means should they do it? Free markets, for example, are a way for us to collaborate. Fantastic way for us to collaborate. Voluntary associations are another one. Government is another vehicle. I think we can probably say with great confidence that if the goal is to collaborate for national defense, probably a good idea to have government as the venue through which we do that rather than, I don't know, a local church.
Yeah. Yeah.
But having that kind of basic concept in the back of your head, and then as you kind of look at problems and figuring out, like, where should that problem be solved? It's just a central challenge of governance. And unfortunately, I don't think it's one that is much deployed today. I think politicians and policymakers feel strongly incentivized to insert government into just about everything. I mean, this is why we have something like 180 federal executive and independent agencies. That's why we have a $6-7 trillion budget. It's not even a budget. It's just $6 or $7 trillion in spending. It's because there's this feeling like, well, we should just have government do something about this. And it's not always the case that that's going to help, and it can actively make things worse.
Wow. Yeah. Powerful words there, Kevin. And kind of tapping into your philosophy hat. When you're thinking about where government comes from, my thought has been, well, it's a demand from the people, and the people find that they don't like something that's going on in the private sector. We need to combine or collectively provide something. And so there's this demand from the public where and then we determine how much it's going to cost, whether, let's say, national defense. How many people do we need to have together to collective? So they're going to need some sort of a salary. Then we might need some bullets and other things that we want. And so that's going to be a cost. We have that cost. And then so the spending side, in my view, you might have a different view, kind of comes in first. And then we can determine how the tax system would look like. I would hope to be the least burdensome form of tax system to fund that limited form of government. And then there we have the tax system. And then we can see how that influences the economy and everything else. But I wonder, from your point of view or your perspective, how can we start to change some of that? Because the spending, and I remember whenever I was in the White House, a lot of people would say, well, the deficits don't matter, or spending isn't the problem. I kept trying to focus on the spending, and OMB, I think, tried to do that as much as possible. But how do we start to change some of the dynamics, though, where I think that there's some truth to this, that deficits don't matter, because I don't know if the public really cares. I don't know. How do we start to change some of those dynamics that are out there? Maybe it's something like the Government Project book. Maybe it's some more things that we need to be doing. Maybe it's podcast. That's why we're both doing some podcasting. But I wondered what your thoughts were there.
Yeah. No, it's, representative democracy. Key word there is representative. And what do we mean by that? Should politicians simply reflect what the people want? Well, it's not surprising that, a rational person would say, I want government to do as much as I feel is appropriate, and I want to pay as little as possible. I mean, that's an attitude that's rational, but it also is probably going to lead to deficits. We also know that due to, the way our brains work, if government provides a benefit, even if they are good enough to give the individual, here's the price tag for it, over time, the individual is going to forget the price tag and that the provision of this service or good is going to be simply assumed. It gets baked into their expectations. It's an entitlement mentality that builds up. So representative government has a kind of natural tendency towards running deficits, because people are going to want stuff. What you need are members of Congress and a president who are willing to lead. And what that means is getting people past that I want to the how can we pay for this conversation, and do we really want to pay this much conversation? Yeah. And right now, neither party is doing that. We've seen a huge dying off in the last 30 years of the deficit hawks. Those are very rare birds. They should be on the endangered species list here in Washington, D.C. And it's become, government by borrowing. And I fear that if we do not have a change of heart and mind in this town in an effort to do right by voters, ultimately we're going to suffer some sort of exogenous shock, whether the bond market goes berserk or something else goes very, very bad. And then the country is going to suffer collectively. And it'll suffer because the people who are supposed to be stewards of our nation's finances took the easy road.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. I think back to what was popularized by Rahm Emanuel about don't let a crisis go to waste. I wonder sometimes how we can make a crisis not go to waste, but in a positive direction. He kind of meant it, and some have taken it that way to say, well, it's a reason to grow government. Don't let a crisis go to waste. Yeah. Let's expand government and everything else. But I wonder if there's a way that we can don't let a crisis go to waste and shrink government. Go back to the limited approach, because, we know about Social Security and Medicare and the potential next decade. They're going to have some pretty big issues. But it's almost like we'll need the act of Congress to wait until those crises come up before they make any changes to them. And it's almost, the two presidential candidates right now with Trump and Biden have basically said they're off the table, which I think is a bad situation. And so it's going to take some time, Kevin, for us to keep working on these things, some job security, I guess, unfortunately, before we can make those changes to see, what can happen. Because if not, I think we're going to continue to be on a road to serfdom, if you will, for going back to Hayek, because we have the situation where mounting debt and deficits and net interest payments on the debt, $1 trillion. And if we don't get control of this, we're going to see higher interest rates, higher inflation, and more economic instability. But I wonder if you can leave us, Kevin, with some positive things for the future. Just, how do you think we should best let people prosper moving forward as we wrap up here in a great conversation today?
Well, a couple of things. I think first, you got to keep doing this podcast, and we need to get more people reminding the country, educating the country on the importance of liberty and why the whole point of government is to preserve liberty. I think that's getting forgotten as people get obsessed about we have to fix this problem, that problem, this problem, that problem. The other thing is that, those of us who work in or around governance, we need to be ready for the crises. We need to prepare ourselves. We should do more things like government project, where we're going to study an agency or a program and come to an honest assessment of its utility. And we should have that ready. So if a conversation comes up, we could say, look, this needs to be pared back, or wait a minute, this program's no good, but this one's super effective. Switch those resources over here. We also need to think about budget process. We need to get a lot of stuff ready so that when the moment of challenge comes, if we can't get ahead of the ball, then for goodness sakes, let's at least be able to meet the challenge intelligently.
Yeah. Well put, Kevin. As usual, for the audience, where's the best place to find you and your information?
Oh, geez. If you just Google AEI Kevin Kosar, you'll probably find my page. Otherwise, you can pop by understandingcongress.org or catch me out on Twitter at Kevin R. Kosar.
Excellent. I'll be sure to put all this stuff in the show notes page for the audience as well. Kevin, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. I always learn something new, and God bless you and your family.
Vance, thank you so much for the podcast and for all you're doing.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. For the audience, hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Please go out and leave us a 5-star rating and write us a review wherever you get your podcast. Be sure to subscribe. You can find all this information at vanceginn.com or vanceginn.substack.com. And until next time, let people prosper.